It's 2026, and most people still believe the loudest person in the room is the strongest. But you already sense something is wrong with that idea. Volume feels impressive for a moment, but it fades quickly. Control, on the other hand, leaves a lasting weight in the room. If you've ever been cornered in a conversation, pressured to react, or subtly shamed into defending yourself, you know how fragile peace can feel. One careless sentence, one spike of anger, one moment where you try to explain yourself, and suddenly you're no longer speaking from clarity. You're standing trial for your dignity. That is the trap. And the reason it works is simple. The other person doesn't need to be right. They only need you to lose your calm. It may have happened at work. A colleague interrupts you repeatedly, talks over you, and treats your voice like it's optional. It may have happened with family, where old dynamics resurface and familiar buttons are pressed with surgical precision. Or it may have happened with someone close to you, someone who knows exactly how to phrase things so you feel small, guilty, or overly sensitive. And the most frustrating part is this. You can be logical, you can be respectful, you can even be kind, and still feel like you're losing, because they keep escalating while you keep trying to stay decent. Afterward, you walk away replaying the conversation in your head, wishing you had said something cleaner, something sharper, something that would have stopped the disrespect without turning you into someone you don't recognize. This is not a failure of intelligence. It's not a lack of courage. It's a misunderstanding of where authority actually lives. Most people believe authority comes from having the perfect response, the strongest argument, or the fastest comeback. Stoic wisdom points somewhere else entirely. Authority begins with self-control. The moment you lose command of your tone, your posture, or your inner state, the center of gravity shifts away from you. The conversation stops being about truth and becomes a contest of emotional force. And emotional force always favors the person who is least invested in staying balanced. The Stoics understood something that modern life keeps trying to distract us from. You cannot control what others say, but you can control what you permit in your mind, in your body, and in your speech. Other people's behavior belongs to them. Your character belongs to you. The danger is not that someone raises their voice or sharpens their words. The danger is that you follow them there. Because the instant you do, you've accepted their rules. You've stepped onto terrain where impulse wins and clarity disappears. This is why calm is not politeness. It is precision. Calm is not weakness. It is restraint with intention. When someone tries to provoke you, they are often seeking one thing above all else: a reaction. Not agreement, not understanding, a reaction. Once they get it, the balance tips, the conversation accelerates, emotions stack, and suddenly you are spending energy defending yourself instead of choosing yourself. Stoicism does not ask you to suppress emotion or become passive. It asks you to recognize the narrow space between stimulus and response and to live there deliberately. That space is where freedom exists. What follows in this video is not a collection of clever lines designed to win arguments or humiliate the other person. Stoicism never taught domination, it taught sovereignty. The goal is not to silence others. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself in moments of pressure. The 7 responses you're about to learn are not weapons. They are anchors. Each one is designed to restore your center when someone tries to pull you into chaos. Used correctly, they don't escalate tension. They drain it. They slow aggressive momentum. They make manipulation awkward. And they expose disrespect without you ever needing to accuse, insult, or explain yourself to exhaustion. There is an order to this path. First comes defense, learning to protect your inner state so that not every tone or accusation can disturb it. Then comes clarity, seeing what is actually happening in the exchange without the fog of reactivity. And finally comes authority, the quiet kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it's felt immediately. These responses work not because they are clever, but because they are aligned with something deeper than ego. They are aligned with self-command. As you listen, Notice which moments resonate most strongly. Those are usually the places where you have been giving away more control than you realized. This is not about becoming cold or distant. It is about becoming steady. When you no longer rush to defend your worth, something shifts. Your nervous system settles, your judgment sharpens, and people begin to sense that you are no longer easy to provoke. Not because you are intimidating, but because you are grounded. That is where real authority lives. And that is where this path begins. One of the earliest tests of self-control appears not in what is said, but in how it is said. There is a specific moment in many conversations when the tone shifts before the words do. The other person leans forward, their voice grows louder. They interrupt, repeat themselves, and speak with urgency, as if volume itself were evidence. This is the moment most people feel an internal pressure to match that energy, to raise their own voice just to stay visible. And the instant they do, something essential is lost. The conversation is no longer guided by clarity. It becomes a contest of emotional force. Stoicism exists precisely to interrupt this pattern. When someone raises their voice, they are rarely trying to understand. More often, they are trying to dominate the emotional space. Loudness is a shortcut used when someone feels uncertain, threatened, or out of control. And when you respond by matching that intensity, you silently accept their rules. You step onto terrain where impulse is rewarded and restraint is mistaken for weakness. This is why the Stoics never equated strength with force. Strength, to them, was self-command. Epictetus warned that a person who cannot govern their own speech will inevitably be governed by their emotions. Control begins with the voice, because the voice is the bridge between your inner state and the world around you. This is where the first response enters, not as a comeback, but as a boundary. "I don't need to raise my voice to be right," said calmly, slowly, without sharpness, not as a challenge and not as a verdict, but as a statement of standard. What matters here is not the sentence itself, but the posture behind it. Your shoulders remain relaxed, your breathing steady. You are not rushing to be heard. You are choosing not to escalate. Beneath the surface, something important happens. Emotional momentum breaks, the room recalibrates, shouting invites resistance, calm invites attention. This response works because it removes the fuel the other person is using. You are not accusing them of shouting. You are not telling them to calm down. You are simply refusing to participate in the theater of escalation. And in that refusal, contrast appears. One person pushing, the other grounded. The deeper Stoic lesson is this: you cannot control how someone speaks to you, but you can control the standard you bring into the exchange. When you keep your voice measured, you protect more than politeness. You protect your nervous system, your clarity, and your credibility. You do not need intensity to prove intelligence. You let composure speak first. This response is not meant to end every conversation. It is meant to reset it. And if the other person continues to escalate after this, you gain something even more valuable than silence. You gain information. You learn that the issue is not misunderstanding, but control, and that awareness will guide your next move. There is another form of provocation that is quieter, but just as corrosive. The voice may not rise, but the words sharpen. Sarcasm slips in. A remark is framed as a joke. A sentence lands with just enough contempt to sting, but not enough to openly accuse. This is where many people lose their footing. The instinct is to defend yourself or to strike back with the same tone, and that is exactly what is being invited. Stoicism teaches you to refuse the invitation without making a scene. This is where the second response belongs. The way you speak says more about you than it does about me. Said evenly, without heat, without moral superiority, simply as a mirror. Psychologically, this does something precise. When someone uses mockery or contempt, they are not communicating information. They are attempting to position themselves above you. The goal is not clarity, it is leverage. If you retaliate, the exchange descends. If you explain yourself, you accept their framing. But when you say this sentence, you step out of the game entirely. You do not attack, you do not defend, you let their tone stand on its own. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the best way to deal with wrongdoing is not to resemble the person who commits it. This response embodies that principle. You are not claiming innocence or superiority. You are refusing to absorb disrespect as if it were yours to carry. Imagine a group setting where someone delivers a cutting remark hoping for a reaction. Instead of stiffening or firing back, you meet their eyes calmly and say this one line. What often follows is a pause, not because you embarrassed them, but because you removed the transfer. Their tone no longer has a destination. Others hear it clearly, and without you accusing anyone, the dynamic shifts. This response protects something essential, your inner posture. Stoicism teaches that dignity is not granted by others. It is maintained by how you respond. When you do not internalize someone else's disrespect, you deprive it of power. You do not carry their bitterness forward. You leave it exactly where it originated. These two responses work together because they establish the same foundation. Your voice stays calm. Your posture stays grounded. Your self-respect is not up for negotiation. Once that foundation is set, something changes. You are no longer reacting to noise. You are choosing standards. And that choice prepares you for the next level of Stoic control, where calm is no longer just maintained, but enforced through clarity. There comes a point in certain conversations when it becomes clear that understanding is no longer the goal. You try to finish a sentence, but you are cut off. You lower your voice, but the other person raises theirs. The exchange speeds up, sharpens, and tightens until it stops being dialogue and becomes a test of endurance. This is usually the moment where people split in two predictable directions. They either explode in order to reclaim dignity, or they stay and slowly abandon themselves just to keep the peace. Stoicism offers a third option: not escalation, not endurance, but standard setting. The Stoics understood that many conflicts are not actually about disagreement. They are about permission. Permission to interrupt. Permission to speak without restraint. Permission to treat the exchange as a performance rather than a conversation. The moment you continue engaging without naming the standard, you silently grant that permission. And once granted, it is rarely returned voluntarily. This is why the next Stoic response is not clever or elaborate. It is simple, final, and clean. "Let's talk when we can do it respectfully," said once, calmly, without explanation, without threat, without the need to be understood immediately. What makes this sentence powerful is what it refuses to do. It does not argue about who is right. It does not defend your position. It does not accuse the other person of being rude, immature, or unfair. It does not invite debate. It simply states a condition. Respect is no longer implied. It is required. And by doing so, you move the center of gravity of the conversation away from content and toward conduct. From a Stoic perspective, this is self-governance in action. Epictetus taught that while you cannot control the behavior of others, you always retain control over what you accept. This response is a direct expression of that teaching. You are not demanding that the other person change. You are clarifying the terms under which you are willing to participate. Everything else, you decline. This distinction matters. Many people confuse boundaries with ultimatums. An ultimatum tries to control the other person. A boundary governs you. When you say this sentence, you are not closing the door permanently. You are pausing the interaction until it can occur within a standard that protects your character. Imagine a family argument where interruptions pile up and voices begin to overlap, or a workplace discussion where disagreement immediately erodes respect. Instead of pushing harder or shrinking back, you pause, you ground yourself, you say the sentence once. Often something unexpected happens. The noise stops, not because you forced it, but because the rules of engagement have been quietly rewritten. This response exposes a truth many people instinctively avoid. Anyone who cannot speak respectfully has already surrendered the moral ground to continue speaking. And when you refuse to engage below a certain level, you protect your energy, your clarity, and your self-respect all at once. Stoicism never taught that peace is maintained by enduring everything. It taught that peace is maintained by choosing wisely where your presence belongs. When you state this boundary calmly, you teach others how to treat you, not through force, but through consistency. And when respect never arrives, when the exchange remains poisoned despite your clarity, you gain confirmation rather than frustration. You learn that the issue was never miscommunication, it was entitlement. There is another layer to this stage that is just as important. Once you have set a standard, you must be willing to honor it yourself. If you state that respect is required and then continue engaging when it is absent, the boundary dissolves. Stoicism demands alignment between word and action. This is not about punishment, it is about coherence. Your calm becomes credible when it is consistent. Over time, people sense this. They understand that your presence is not automatic, it is chosen, and choice carries weight. Setting standards without fighting is a turning point on the Stoic path because it marks the shift from defense to clarity. You are no longer reacting to behavior, you are defining the conditions under which you remain. This clarity simplifies everything. You stop asking how to win arguments and start asking whether an interaction deserves your energy at all. And that question changes how you move through conversations, relationships, and conflict. Once standards are set and honored, you no longer need to raise your voice or sharpen your words. You have already said the most important thing. The next stage builds on this clarity, showing how to use composure not just to protect boundaries, but to quietly take control of the exchange itself. Once standards are set, the nature of the conflict changes. The noise softens, but tension may remain. At this stage, provocation often takes a more subtle form. The voice may calm down, but the words carry implication. A comment is delivered with confidence, but without substance. A judgment is stated as if it were obvious, leaving you feeling quietly diminished or questioned. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They rush to defend themselves, listing reasons, clarifying intentions, trying to reclaim ground that was never actually lost. Stoicism teaches a different response. When provocation hides behind certainty, clarity becomes your most effective tool. This is where curiosity enters, not as weakness, but as composure with direction. I see your point. Help me understand your reasoning, said sincerely, not as a trap, not as sarcasm, simply as an invitation to move from emotion to logic. What happens next is almost always revealing. Vague criticism struggles when it is asked to stand on something solid. Many people speak with confidence, not because they have thought deeply, but because they are reacting, projecting frustration, insecurity, or impatience. When you ask them to explain their reasoning, you quietly shift the conversation out of instinct and into examination. And examination changes everything. From a Stoic perspective, this response protects your inner freedom. Epictetus reminded his students that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the judgments they attach to them. By responding with curiosity instead of defense, you refuse to attach the judgment that you are being attacked. You treat the comment as information, not as a verdict on your worth. This keeps your mind sovereign. You are not scrambling to protect an image. You are standing in clarity, and clarity has a quiet authority that aggression never achieves. There are two outcomes here, and both serve you. Sometimes the other person hesitates. They realize they do not actually have a clear explanation. The confidence fades, the tone softens. In group settings, this shift is especially visible. Without you doing anything confrontational, the room senses the difference between noise and substance. Other times, the person does offer a thoughtful explanation. That too is a win. You gain insight. You refine your thinking. You demonstrate that your ego is not fragile, that you are capable of learning publicly without losing stature. Stoicism admired this posture because it places truth above pride. There is a second response that builds on the same principle, especially when a comment feels dismissive rather than directly confrontational. That's an interesting perspective. What made you think of it? This sentence does something precise. It returns responsibility for meaning to the speaker. You are no longer under examination. They are. Most provocative remarks are not built on reflection. They are built on habit, assumption, or borrowed opinion. When you ask where the perspective came from, you expose that foundation without accusation. Often, the comment loses its weight the moment it has to explain itself. Marcus Aurelius warned against being disturbed by opinions that are not grounded in reason. These responses keep you aligned with that teaching. You do not argue with assumptions. You allow reason to enter the room and let it do the work. In both cases, you remain steady. You do not gain respect by overpowering someone. You gain it by not needing to. Your composure communicates that you are not threatened by scrutiny because your sense of self is not dependent on immediate approval. There is an important discipline here. These responses only work when they are genuine. If your tone carries irony, they turn into traps and invite resistance. Stoicism demands sincerity because its power comes from alignment, not performance. When curiosity is real, it disarms without humiliating. It invites explanation instead of escalation. And in a world addicted to quick judgments, that invitation alone sets you apart. Turning provocation into clarity is a pivotal stage on the Stoic path. You are no longer merely protecting yourself from chaos. You are redirecting it. You show that emotional force does not decide meaning, reason does. At this level, control is no longer about holding your ground. It is about elevating the exchange. And when clarity enters, many conflicts quietly dissolve on their own. For those that do not, for situations where criticism carries truth but arrives wrapped in tension or frustration, another kind of Stoic strength is required, one that listens without surrendering and remains open without collapsing. That is where the next response begins. Not every difficult exchange is an attack. This is a distinction many people miss, and it costs them clarity. There are moments when the tone is sharp, the timing is poor, and the delivery feels aggressive, but beneath it, there is something real, a pattern you may have overlooked, a consequence you did not fully consider, a truth that arrived without care. Most people react defensively in these moments, not because the message is wrong, but because the tone feels threatening. Once defensiveness enters, learning leaves. Stoicism asks you to slow this moment down and separate signal from noise. This is where the next Stoic response belongs. I appreciate you sharing that. Simple, grounded, unexpected. This sentence is not agreement. It is not surrender. It is not an apology. It is acknowledgement without self-erasure. What it does is remove hostility from the center of the exchange without denying the possibility of truth. When people feel heard, even briefly, their need to push harder often dissolves. Pressure drops. And when pressure drops, conversation becomes possible. Stoic wisdom values alignment with reality over protection of ego. Seneca warned that nothing wastes more time than defending an identity that refuses to learn. This response reflects the opposite posture. You are not rushing to correct the other person's tone. You are not collapsing into guilt. You are keeping your inner state stable while allowing information to exist. You listen without absorbing emotional force. You remain open without becoming exposed. This balance is rare, and people feel it immediately. Imagine a workplace conversation where criticism is delivered bluntly, even unfairly, or a personal relationship where frustration spills out without structure. Instead of counterattacking or retreating into silence, you acknowledge the signal beneath the noise. Often the effect is immediate. The other person slows down, Their shoulders drop, the edge softens. The exchange moves from accusation toward problem solving, not because you gave in, but because you did not resist unnecessarily. There is quiet strength in this response. It signals that your sense of self is stable enough to receive feedback without collapsing or hardening. You do not need to prove that you are flawless. You do not need to correct everything in real time. You trust yourself enough to listen first. That trust, both in yourself and in the process, creates space for clarity. Stoicism does not require you to accept every critique. It requires you to discern, to know when there is something to learn and when there is nothing to engage. This is why this response is not for every situation. It is meant for moments where there is value buried under poor delivery. When used correctly, it transforms friction into cooperation and criticism into insight. It keeps you anchored in choice rather than reaction. You decide what enters your mind and what does not. You decide what is worth carrying forward and what is not. But there are moments when words cross a clear line, when feedback becomes humiliation, when critique becomes performance, when the goal is no longer improvement, but provocation. In those moments, listening longer does not create wisdom. It creates self-betrayal. Stoicism does not ask you to endure disrespect in the name of growth. It asks you to know when to disengage with dignity. That discernment leads to the final level of Stoic control, where silence itself becomes an act of authority, not avoidance. That is where the path completes. There are moments when words stop being information and become performance. A remark is delivered publicly, sharply, and with intention not to clarify, not to improve, but to provoke. The room goes quiet. All eyes turn toward you, and in that silence, the familiar surge appears. The urge to defend your competence, to explain your intent, to prove your worth before the moment hardens into judgment. This is where most people lose control, not because the attack was strong, but because the pressure to react was. Stoicism offers a final response for this moment, and it is not a sentence, it is a pause. A deliberate pause changes the entire field. Not dramatic, not defiant, just long enough for the words to settle in the air without interruption. And then, calmly, you say, "Thank you for that insight." Nothing more. No explanation, no correction, no counterattack. What gives this response its power is not what you say, but what you refuse to do. You refuse to dilute the moment with defensiveness. You refuse to rescue the other person from the weight of their own words. You allow the comment to stand fully exposed. From a Stoic perspective, this is mastery. Epictetus taught that events themselves do not disturb us. Our judgments about them do. In this moment, you choose not to judge the remark as a threat. You choose not to treat it as a verdict. You allow it to exist without rearranging your inner state around it. While the other person acts from impulse, insecurity, or the desire for dominance, you act from choice. And that contrast is unmistakable. What often follows is discomfort, but not yours. The person who spoke begins to sense the imbalance. Their words, highlighted by your composure, suddenly feel excessive. In group settings, this effect is even stronger. You have not embarrassed them. You have not exposed them. You have simply declined to interfere. You did not rush to explain. You did not rush to defend. And in that space, reality does its own work. Stoicism understands that not every situation requires correction. Some require containment. Silence, when grounded, becomes that container. This response is not passive, it is precise. It signals that you heard the remark, that you are unaffected by its intent, and that you are not interested in escalating. You protect your dignity without a single aggressive word, and because you did not attack, there is nothing for the other person to defend against. The exchange ends not with noise, but with clarity. This is the highest level of Stoic control. When you can remain steady under public pressure, you no longer need strategies to silence others. Your presence does it for you. Calm here is not restraint, it is sovereignty. All 7 Stoic responses share a single purpose. None of them are designed to dominate another person. They are designed to protect you. In a world that constantly provokes, interrupts, and pressures you to react, the rarest form of strength is not the perfect comeback. It is knowing when your peace no longer needs to be defended. The Stoics never measured power by how much noise someone could make. They measured it by how little a person was shaken when that noise arrived. When you stop chasing the last word, something subtle happens. Your nervous system settles, your judgment sharpens, and people begin to sense that you are no longer easy to provoke. Not because you are cold, but because you are grounded. This is where real authority lives. Not in intimidation, not in explanation, but in composure that cannot be stolen. Calm is not weakness. It is unstealable power. Take a moment and reflect honestly. Which of these responses do you need most right now? Not to silence others, but to stop abandoning yourself in difficult conversations. You do not need to use all of them. You only need the one that returns you to center when pressure appears. That is the Stoic path in practice. Not perfection, not dominance, but consistent self-command. When you carry yourself this way, conflict loses its grip, and you move through the world with a quiet authority that no one can take from you.